They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce thought when he saw Elena Martinez moving through the corridors of St. Michael's Hospital at 2,247 hours, her badge clipped to scrubs that had been washed so many times the navy had faded to grey. He didn't know. He had no idea what those hands had done. The graveyard shift at St. Michael's in Colorado Springs run skeleton crews and long silences, the kind of night work that breaks people who aren't built for it. Elena was built for worse. She arrived at 2,200 sharp, the way someone arrives who has spent 12 years showing up when it mattered. 12 years in Special Forces. 12 years in Ramadi where the heat came off the street like it wanted to kill you and the sound of mortars became background noise, like rain. Now it was fluorescent light and the hiss of ventilators, the beep of monitors measuring lives in beats per minute. Different kind of battlefield. Same kind of precision required. The corridors of St. Michael's were painted institutional beige, the color of places where people learned they were stronger than they thought. Or broke. Elena moved through them like she was reading a map that wasn't there. Left at the nursing station. Past the post-op recovery bays. The smell hit first, antiseptic layered over something underneath it, something chemical and clean that never quite masked the reality of blood and wound drainage underneath. She'd smelled worse. Much worse. In Ramadi the smell of the field hospital had been copper and diesel and human waste, the smell of men who'd been hit and were still bleeding. This was better. This was controlled. This was the kind of medical crisis that happened inside walls. Elena clocked in at the main station. Sarah Chen looked up from her charts, eyes tired the way eyes get at 2 in the morning when the world outside the hospital had stopped existing and the only reality was machines and fluids and the invisible line between alive and not alive. Sarah was good. 28 years old, 3 years into nursing, the kind of focused intensity that meant she'd make it past the 5-year mark when most floor nurses burned out. Elena nodded once. Sarah went back to her charts. The locker room was empty. Elena had planned it that way. Graveyard shift meant peace if you worked it right, meant the senior staff was sleeping and the administrators weren't creeping through hallways looking for someone to make an example of. Her locker was third from the corner, combination lock that she opened without thinking about the sequence, muscle memory from a different life, the kind of precision that came from opening ammunition boxes in the dark. The door swung open and there it was. The field journal sat on the top shelf, leather cover worn soft from handling, color of old coffee and dust. She reached for it without consciously deciding to reach. Her fingers knew the weight of it. They knew the texture. She opened it to the middle, where the pressed flowers were densest, and there they were, tiny yellow desert blossoms, the kind that bloomed in Ramadi in the spring when the city wasn't exploding. She'd pressed them between pages during the quiet hours, the hours when the combat teams were out and the medical tent was empty and she had time to remember that flowers existed. That beauty existed. That the world contained things that weren't blood. She didn't close the journal immediately. She just held it, her hands perfectly steady, the way they always were. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline caught the fluorescent light wrong. It was faint enough that most people didn't see it. The ones who did usually didn't ask. She'd learned that in Ramadi too. You didn't ask questions about scars. You didn't ask about the rank someone had held or the decisions they'd made or why a commander was walking a hospital floor pushing a medication cart. You just worked. You just moved forward. You just kept the next person alive. Elena closed the journal and returned it to the shelf. It was 2,218 hours. She had a shift to work. The hospital was quiet in the way hospitals got quiet between the chaos of evening discharge and the crisis hours of early morning. Post-op recovery was stable. 3 patients in the ICU, all monitored, all drifting in pharmaceutical sleep. Elena moved to the first room, elderly man, pneumonia recovery, day 3 post-extubation. She checked his vitals without waking him, her movements the kind of economical precision that came from moving through tents full of sleeping wounded. The monitor showed steady oxygen saturation at 96%. Heart rate regular. She made a note and moved to the next bed. Patient 2 was a woman in her 60s recovering from a bowel resection. Surgical site clean, dressing dry, vital stable. Elena replaced the 4-fluid bag with practiced efficiency, the kind of movement that looked effortless because she'd done it thousands of times. 843 days in Ramadi. Some of those days she'd started 17 fours in veins that were collapsed from shock and dehydration, her hands moving steady while artillery shook the floor. A stationary patient in a climate-controlled room was easier work. It was patient 3 that changed the shape of the night. She was a young man, maybe 24, admitted 6 hours earlier with acute compartment syndrome in his left leg. Motorcycle accident. The pressure was building in the fascial compartments, squeezing the blood supply and making the muscles start to die. Bad injury. The kind that needed an emergency fasciotomy to relieve the pressure, to cut into the leg and release the constriction before permanent tissue damage happened. The surgeon on call was Dr. Harrison, competent and fast. The patient was scheduled for OR at 0400. Everything was lined up. Everything was in order. But when Elena checked the monitors, she saw the trend. The pressure was climbing faster than anyone expected. She made a note of it, checked the time, calculated the timeline. The OR wouldn't be ready for 93 minutes. The tissue death would start in 60. She updated the chart and did what you did in a hospital. She reported it to the charge nurse. She flagged it for the surgeon. She did everything by protocol because protocol was how systems worked and systems were supposed to keep people alive. Elena was checking supplies in the medication room when it happened. The intercom crackled and a voice she recognized, not pleasant to recognize but recognized, came through the speaker. Marta Martinez. Report to my office. The room went very quiet. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed their constant, humming frequency, the sound of endless electricity trying to make day out of night. Elena set down the 4 kit she was holding. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause longer than the physical motion required. She simply turned and walked toward the administrative offices, her stride exactly the same as it had been for the past 3 hours. Dr. Pierce was waiting. He sat behind a desk that was too large for his office, the kind of furniture choice that told you something about what he thought he needed to project. Designer watch catching the light. Hair graying at the temples in the exact way that made other men think he was distinguished. Elena had worked with genuine distinction for 12 years. She could spot the imitation. What she saw when she looked at Dr. Pierce was a man who wanted power more than he wanted to use it well. That was the dangerous kind. "Close the door," he said. Elena did. The latch caught with a soft click that sounded very loud in the small space. "You flagged the compartment syndrome case as urgent," Pierce said, not looking up from his computer. "You recommended expediting the surgical timeline. The pressure trend indicates tissue compromise within the window," Elena said. Her voice was even. Neither defending nor apologizing. Just stating fact. Pierce finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of winter sky, the kind of color that could look cold under the right light. "You're a nurse. You monitor and report. You don't make surgical recommendations." "I'm a nurse with 12 years of trauma response experience," Elena said. The words came out flat. "Just data. The tissue will start to die in approximately 55 minutes. The fasciotomy should happen now." "The fasciotomy will happen when Dr. Harrison is ready," Pierce said, and smiled. It wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. "And you'll be relieved of your role on that case. Sarah Chen will take over patient monitoring. You can find something else to do." Elena didn't respond immediately. She stood there, her hands at her sides, perfectly still. The composure that had gotten her through negotiations with tribal leaders and complex medical decisions under fire was exactly what she needed now. Don't show anger. Don't show frustration. Don't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd landed a blow. "Understood," she said finally. Pierce went back to his computer. Dismissed her without looking up. Elena turned and left the office, closing the door behind her with the same careful precision with which she'd entered. The hallway was empty. She walked back to the medication room and resumed what she'd been doing, her hands moving through the inventory of 4 kits and saline bags with the same steady rhythm. But something had changed in the shape of the night. Something had shifted from routine to something else. She could feel it the way you felt a change in air pressure before a storm. Sarah was at the nursing station when Elena returned to the floor. Elena briefed her on the compartment syndrome patient without explaining why the reassignment had happened. Just the facts. The trend. The timeline. The vitals. Sarah nodded, understanding the urgency, moving into position at the bedside. Elena moved back through the corridors of St. Michael's, and the quiet of the graveyard shift suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric song. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Outside the windows, Colorado Springs slept in the darkness before dawn, the city spread out below the hospital like someone's scattered dreams. Elena had been trained to move through darkness. She'd learned to see what others missed. She'd learned that the world contained both beauty pressed between pages and men who used systems to hurt people, and that sometimes you had to choose which kind of person you were going to be. It was 2,256 hours. The night was still very young. The medication discrepancy started small. A missing syringe here, an extra line item there. Elena had been tracking it for weeks, cross-referencing the physical inventory against the billing reports, because that's what you did when you noticed things that didn't add up. The nurse's station computer sat idle at 2:14 a.m. Third floor corridor empty except for the distant hum of ventilators and the rhythmic beeping of monitors keeping vigil over sleeping patients. She pulled up the supply records and clicked into the billing database. 1 tab. 2 tabs. By the 3rd tab, she found it. The name jumped off the screen, Dr. Pierce. Listed as a secondary payee on 14 separate purchase orders. Equipment costs marked up 40% above market value, a surgical light listed at $18,000 when the manufacturer's catalog showed $12,800. Anesthesia machines inflated by $6,200 each. Suction units. Monitors. Ventilators. All of it moving through the same vendor, all of it carrying the same pattern of excess, all of it flowing to an account with Pierce's name attached. Elena's hands remained steady as she photographed the screen with her phone. 12 photos. Clear enough to see the numbers, the dates, the secondary payee code. She closed the browser, cleared the history, and went back to checking 4 lines at 2:31 a.m., her mind already moving through the calculus of what she'd just seen and what she absolutely could not unsee. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of pretending the knowledge didn't exist, of wondering if she should report it, of recognizing that the hospital's compliance officer was on the golf course every weekend with administration. 3 weeks of Elena moving through her shifts the way she always did, quiet, competent, invisible. Then came the morning rounds. Dr. Pierce picked up the nurse's station phone at 7:47 a.m. Elena was checking the medication cart. The hospital-wide intercom crackled to life with a distinctive electronic burp that made every staff member pause. "Could Marta Martinez please report to the supply room?" His voice carried the slight drawl of someone enjoying himself. "That's Marta Martinez, patron saint of impossible cases and lost causes." The laughter started in the ER, rippled through recovery, echoed down the corridors. Elena's jaw clenched once, a single muscle contraction visible only to someone looking for it. She didn't look up from the medication cart. Her fingers continued their mechanical dance, pulling syringes, checking labels, updating the count sheet with handwriting that didn't waver by a single millimeter. Around her, 2 residents exchanged glances. A nursing aide bit her lip. Elena checked the next line. She never reported to the supply room. Dr. Pierce never called again. But the nickname had been planted, and it would grow like an infection. The supply closet on the 3rd floor measured 8 by 12 feet. Metal shelving climbed the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with 4 kits, central line materials, dressing supplies, and the 1,000 small components that kept a hospital functioning. Elena reached for the boxes of 14-gauge angiocaths at 2:33 p.m., her hands moving in the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this task 2,000 times before. Dr. Pierce entered 30 seconds later. She heard the door close behind him with a soft metallic click. He positioned himself between her and the exit, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't quite cover the sharp chemical scent of his skin. His presence changed the air pressure in the small space, compressed it, made it harder to breathe without acknowledging him. "You've been asking questions," he said quietly. Not angry. Worse than anger. The tone of someone explaining something to a child who should already understand. "Departmental procedures." He stepped slightly closer. "Supply orders. Billing codes. Administrative matters that aren't your concern." Elena held the box of 4 kits against her chest. Her heart rate remained at 62 beats per minute. Her breathing continued at its regular rhythm. She had been trained for 7 years to keep her body in perfect compliance when her mind wanted to respond with violence. "I need you to understand something very clearly." His voice dropped lower. "Your job exists because I allow it to exist. I signed off on your hire. I can sign off on your termination. 1 phone call to the board. 1 conversation with HR. Your nursing license stays valid, but your employment becomes impossible to secure anywhere from here to Arizona." Elena maintained eye contact. His eyes were the pale blue of someone who had never been told no, who had never felt consequences accelerate toward him like a vehicle with failed brakes. "Keep asking questions about departmental procedures," he continued, "and I'll make sure you never work in healthcare again. Are we clear, Nurse Martinez?" Her voice came out flat, emotionless, the voice of someone reading medication labels aloud. "Perfectly clear, Doctor." He held her gaze for 2 more seconds, a test, checking to see if she would blink first. Elena's pupils didn't dilate. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She was looking at him the way a sniper looks at a distant target, present but not engaged, waiting. He stepped aside. She walked out with the 4 kits and didn't look back. But that night, alone in the break room at 3 a.m., she gripped the counter edge hard enough that her knuckles turned white, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. A face she almost didn't recognize looked back at her, still Elena, still steady, still composed. But underneath that surface, something was moving. Something that had learned to recognize patterns of predatory behavior because it had survived worse predators than this. The parking lot was where it happened. End of shift. The day and night crews overlapped during the 11 to 7 turnover, a 30-minute window when nurses and techs moved between vehicles like schools of fish, their tired voices carrying across the asphalt under Colorado Springs' unforgiving afternoon sun. Elena emerged from the employee entrance at 7:11 a.m. Dr. Pierce stood waiting by the door, holding a printed memo, his posture arranged to ensure maximum visibility to both the departing night shift and the arriving day crew. "Nurse Martinez." He didn't need to raise his voice. The parking lot conversation died the way conversations do when someone is being publicly addressed. 14 staff members stopped moving. 14 pairs of eyes turned. A respiratory therapist paused with her hand on her car door. 2 orderlies froze mid-stride. The surgical nurse from the day shift, Demetrius, looked at Elena with the expression of someone watching something bad happen in slow motion. "Effective immediately," Dr. Pierce said, extending the memo toward her, "you're being removed from charge nurse responsibilities and reassigned to basic floor duty." Elena took the memo. The paper felt impossibly thin between her fingers. "Your judgment calls have been questionable." His voice remained pleasant, conversational. "Your attitude toward hospital hierarchy is concerning. Frankly, we need someone in leadership who understands teamwork and chain of command. Someone who recognizes their limitations." Elena folded the memo once. The crease was perfect, symmetrical, the work of someone who maintained precision even during moments when precision was the only thing keeping her from doing something irreversible. "You'll be notified of your new schedule by HR." Dr. Pierce turned away as though he had already forgotten her. "Congratulations on the reassignment." Elena walked to her car. 14 people watched her go. The day shift nurse, Sarah Chen, looked like she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. Elena opened her door, placed the memo on the passenger seat, and drove home in the early morning light without turning on the radio. The break room was empty at 3 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical song, a sound like insects trapped in the ceiling. Elena gripped the edge of the Formica counter. Her knuckles went white. Not from anger. From something deeper, the trembling of someone holding back an avalanche with her bare hands. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman she almost recognized. Still composed. Still steady. Still capable. But the eyes were different now. They held something that hadn't been there before. Something cold and waiting, like a predator that has finally caught the scent of blood in the water. The night continued its endless rotation. Elena finished her shift, drove home as dawn broke pink across the eastern sky, and sat in her apartment with the memo still folded in her hand, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Dr. Pierce had made his first real move. But he had no idea who he was moving against. The ambulance call came through the dispatch radio at 11:47 p.m. 47-year-old male, acute compartment syndrome, bilateral lower extremities, transferred from 3 separate facilities over the past 6 hours. The intake nurse, a veteran named Marcus who'd worked emergency medicine for 16 years, shook his head as he logged the patient information. Deaf patient. Complex presentation. Nobody wanted him. Elena was restocking the trauma bay when Marcus appeared in the doorway holding the chart. His expression said everything before he spoke. We've got incoming. Male, 67, not 67 as dispatch said. Chart says he's been through the system. St. Luke's refused him. Denver General refused him. Community Hospital in the Springs turned him away an hour ago. 10 different doctors have already declined this case. Why? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Complex cases with deaf patients meant communication barriers, meant liability exposure, meant doctors choosing easier admissions. Compartment pressures elevated in both anterior and lateral compartments. Progressive swelling starting about 9 hours ago. Pain management is difficult when you can't communicate verbally. Most places don't want to risk it. Marcus set the chart on the counter. His jaw was tight. The family's desperate. They drove him up from Pueblo an hour ago. Elena took the chart. Read the name. Colonel Marcus Webb. The world didn't stop. The machines didn't falter. The overhead lights continued their electric hum. But something in Elena's chest compressed like a fist tightening around her lungs, and she had to set the chart down on the counter because her hands had suddenly become something she needed to think about controlling. Marcus Webb. The man who had sat across from her in a military hearing room in Ramadi on a day in March when the temperature hit 127 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there like the sun had given up trying to find another planet. The man who had listened to testimony from 5 officers about a mission decision she'd made, a civilian casualty, unavoidable, justified under rules of engagement but politically impossible, and who had methodically, systematically, with the precision of a surgeon performing an amputation, dismantled her military career in front of a judge advocate, 2 enlisted witnesses, and a room full of people who had once respected her. She had been a commander then. Full authority. Direct orders. 23 soldiers under her command who trusted her tactical decisions. One mission, one choice, one moment where the rules of engagement and the reality of the situation had diverged, and she had chosen lives over protocol. The insurgent position had been occupied by a family, 4 civilians, 2 of them children, in addition to the military targets. She had called for repositioning instead of air support. One of her soldiers had been hit by sniper fire while executing that repositioning. Sergeant David Halloway, 22 years old, 2 weeks from his first leave in 14 months. The shot had been through the femoral artery. She had applied direct pressure for 43 seconds before the medic reached him, and she had watched his blood darken the desert sand the color of rust. Then the hearing. Then Marcus Webb, with his measured voice and his perfectly constructed timeline of her decisions and his recommendation that she be separated from service with loss of rank and a permanent notation on her discharge papers that would make employment nearly impossible anywhere that valued security clearance or background verification. She had survived. She had rebuilt. But she had never forgotten the sound of his voice saying, "In the opinion of this board, Commander Martinez exercised poor judgment and failed to prioritize the safety of her personnel in favor of an unauthorized humanitarian operation." Elena picked up the chart. Her hands were steady. She flipped through the preliminary diagnostics and felt the weight of the past collide with the present in a way that made her want to laugh and grieve simultaneously. The compartment pressure readings were already documented. Right leg anterior compartment, 38 millimeters of mercury. Left leg anterior compartment, 41 millimeters of mercury. Normal pressure was 8 to 12 millimeters of mercury. Anything over 30 meant tissue damage was beginning. Anything over 40 meant the clock had started ticking toward permanent loss of function. Tissue death within the hour if intervention didn't occur. Rhabdomyolysis if the pressure built much higher. Acute kidney injury from myoglobin flooding the kidneys. Sepsis. Multi-organ failure. Death. When does he arrive? Elena asked Marcus. 12 minutes. Maybe less. They're running lights the whole way up I-25. Elena nodded and began moving. Pulling trauma supplies. Setting up the ultrasound to assess fluid status. Running labs on the hospital system to see what baseline work the other hospitals had documented. CK levels. Creatinine. White blood cell count. Potassium. Everything that would tell her how badly the muscles were already breaking down. The ambulance doors burst open at 11:59 p.m. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher in with practice speed, calling out vitals with the clipped precision of people who had done this 1,000 times. Blood pressure 156/92. Heart rate 118. O2 sat 94 on room air. The patient, Colonel Marcus Webb, lay on the stretcher with his eyes closed, his face contorted with pain that went beyond words because he had learned a long time ago that words didn't reach him the same way they reached other people. Elena moved to the stretcher. Examined his legs. The swelling was dramatic. Both lower extremities distended, the skin stretched tight and shiny, the muscles beneath so rigid they looked like they might split the skin open. She pressed her fingers against the anterior compartment of his right leg. The tissue was hard. Unyielding. Like pressing against wood. When she released the pressure, the skin didn't blanch. That was bad. That meant the pressure inside the compartment was probably already above 40 millimeters of mercury. That meant they were past the window where conservative management would work. Severe compartment syndrome, Elena said to Marcus and the other nurses. Bilateral. Pressures look critical based on physical exam. We need to page surgical consult immediately. Sarah Cheng grabbed the phone. Paged the on-call surgeon. They waited. For minutes. 5 minutes. The phone rang back. A doctor Elena didn't recognize said, "Thanks for the call, but we're not taking any new admits tonight. The patient's compartment syndrome is progressing too rapidly. Transfer him to the VA hospital in Denver. They have a vascular surgery team on standby for this kind of presentation." "He won't survive the transfer," Elena said. She took the phone from Sarah. "The tissue is already compromised. The compartments are losing perfusion. Every minute we're not intervening, we're losing viable muscle." "I understand," the surgeon said. "But this case is outside our capacity. Transfer him now." The line went dead. Elena handed the phone back to Sarah and walked toward Dr. Pierce's office. It was 12:14 a.m. The night had that particular quality of emptiness that only hospital nights possessed, the sense that the entire world had shrunk to these corridors and these machines and the small group of people trying to hold back the tide of entropy with their bare hands. She found Dr. Pierce at his desk, reviewing something on his computer. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted to that familiar mixture of condescension and disinterest that had become his default when addressing her over the past few weeks. "We have a patient in critical compartment syndrome," Elena said. She set the chart on his desk and pointed to the pressure readings, the swelling, the lab values that were already showing the muscles breaking down. Bilateral anterior and lateral compartments. Pressures over 40. Surgical consult declined. But this patient needs immediate fasciotomy or he loses both legs. Dr. Pierce leaned back in his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The surgical team has evaluated this case and declined intervention. Their decision stands. Make the patient comfortable and prepare transfer paperwork for the VA. That's a direct order. He won't survive transfer, Elena repeated. Then document that we recommended immediate transfer and that the patient's condition prevented it. This conversation is over. She left his office. The hallway was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors in the distance and the whisper of ventilators. She walked past the nurse's station back toward the trauma bay, and as she passed Dr. Pierce's office again, she saw that the door was slightly ajar. She heard his voice inside, low and urgent. "I need you to document that surgical consult was offered and refused by the patient's family." "Yes, I know that's not what happened." "Document it anyway." "No, she doesn't have authority to order procedures." "I need that in writing before she finishes her shift." "The witness statements can confirm that." "Do it now." Elena kept walking. At 3:17 a.m., Colonel Webb's blood pressure dropped to 94/58. At 3:28 a.m., the latest compartment pressure reading spiked to 53 millimeters of mercury in his right anterior compartment. At 3:35 a.m., the lab called with a critical potassium level of 7.2, the muscle breakdown was releasing electrolytes that could stop his heart in minutes. Elena stood at his bedside and looked at the man who had destroyed her career. His face was pale. His breathing was shallow. His body was dying in real time because 10 doctors had said no and 1 doctor had said no louder than the rest. She stood there for 10 seconds. Long enough to think about walking away. Long enough to think about how the world had already decided what she should be, just a nurse, just an employee, just someone who followed orders and accepted decisions made by people who carried more authority and less responsibility. Then she pulled the crash cart to the bedside. "Get me a witness and document everything," she said to Sarah, and her voice was absolutely calm, the voice of someone who had already made peace with every consequence that was about to follow. "Timestamp every vitals reading. Record that surgical consult was requested twice and refused. Everything. Every moment." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Elena?" "Now, Sarah." Elena reached for the sterile field. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had cut into human tissue under far worse conditions than a sterile hospital room. Under sandstorms that turned the air into static. Under the weight of combat boots and plate carriers and the knowledge that if she made one wrong move, people died. She had done this before in a makeshift aid station in Ramadi where the walls were corrugated metal and the only light came from chemical glow sticks and the muzzle flashes of outgoing fire. She could do this in a hospital with proper lighting and proper equipment and the only thing at stake being her career. The monitors sang their monotonous beeping at 2:15 a.m. Colonel Webb's pressure had been climbing for the past 30 minutes, and Elena watched the hand-held compartment pressure monitor like a weapon trained on her own chest. Anterior compartment, left leg, 42 millimeters of mercury. Anterior compartment, right leg, 44. The numbers meant tissue death in motion. Meant permanent disability. Meant amputation if no one intervened in the next hour. She documented each reading in careful handwriting on Webb's chart, 42, 44, 43, 45, building a record that proved what everyone in this hospital had chosen to ignore. Sarah Chen stood beside her, trembling slightly as she watched the color drain from Webb's lower legs, the skin taking on that waxy, suffocating pallor that meant the muscle beneath was dying one fiber at a time. Elena had seen this before. Not in a hospital. in a makeshift aid station in Ramadi where the walls were corrugated metal and the only light came from chemical glow sticks and the muzzle flashes of outgoing fire. She could do this in a hospital with proper lighting and proper equipment and nothing at stake but her career. Elena paged the on-call surgeon at 2:47 a.m. Waited. Called again at 2:58. The surgeon's voicemail picked up both times. She knew what would happen if she waited for protocol to follow its bureaucratic path. By the time anyone responded, the tissue would be irreversible. Necrotic. Webb would wake up minus both calves, and Dr. Pierce would file it under acceptable losses. The sort of outcome that looked reasonable on paper, in a hospital that made money keeping patients alive just long enough to maximize billing codes. At 3:15 a.m., Elena walked to the supply room. Sarah followed without asking why. They both knew. Elena gathered the equipment like someone collecting her own heartbeat: sterile drapes, 1% lidocaine, 14-gauge angiocath needles for local anesthesia, surgical scissors, scalpel with a fresh blade that caught the fluorescent light like a small, precise tooth. She moved with the economical grace of someone who had counted seconds before and knew the weight of each one. A trauma tray. Hemostatic gauze. 2 units of O-negative blood stood waiting in the crash cart like soldiers understanding orders without needing to hear them spoken aloud. By 3:52 a.m., Elena had the field set up in Webb's room. She didn't ask permission. Asking for permission was a civilian gesture, and Elena had stopped being a civilian the moment she saw those compartment pressures climbing. She spoke once: "Stay." Sarah understood and positioned herself at the vitals monitor, her hands already shaking but her eyes locked on the screens. Elena moved her own hands through the ritual of sterility, glove layers like armor, mask secured, hair back, mind crystalline and clean. The first incision was the hardest because it was the most familiar. Elena's scalpel touched skin at the anterior compartment of Webb's left leg, making the first cut through dermis and subcutaneous tissue with the kind of controlled pressure that only comes from having done it before, under fire, in darkness, with mortar rounds shaking the roof and someone bleeding out beneath your hands. Not a hesitation. Not a tremor. Just the muscle memory that lives in your forearms and your fingers and your spine, older than any hospital credential, older than her nursing license by 9 years. The fascia beneath was pearl gray and tight as a drum. Elena could see the pressure in it, could see the tissue suffocating behind that unyielding membrane. She made the fascial incision, a small, precise opening that released the pressure like air escaping from a wound. The sound was almost silent. Just the softest hiss of pressure equalizing. Blood began to flow back into the compartment immediately, color returning to the muscle like someone turning up a dimmer switch. 40 millimeters of mercury released in seconds. Sarah's voice came quiet and steady, left anterior decompressed. Vitals holding. BP 118/76. Elena moved to the lateral compartment, the blade sliding through fascia with the same controlled precision. Another release. Another hiss. Webb's vitals remained stable, our blood pressure steady, heart rate holding at 89, oxygen saturation at 98%. The body understood what was happening. The body was relieved. Elena repeated the procedure on the right leg, making the anterior incision, accessing the lateral compartment, releasing the pressure that had been suffocating tissue from the inside out. The second leg took 7 minutes. The color returned faster this time. The body was already healing. By 4:12 a.m., Elena was closing the incisions using interrupted sutures, each stitch precise and clean, the kind of finishing work that military medics learn because the patients who survive are the ones who don't develop infections in field hospitals 300 kilometers from a real operating room. Sarah continued calling out vitals, her voice stronger now, no longer trembling. The monitors sang their steady song, sinus rhythm, blood pressure holding, oxygen climbing. Webb's legs were saved. The tissue would regenerate. The man who had destroyed her career 8 years ago would walk again because Elena Martinez would not allow the hospital to bury him under acceptable losses and bureaucratic silence. The wound dressing was in place at 4:27 a.m. Elena stepped back, stripped her gloves, and allowed herself a single long breath. Sarah was crying silently, staring at the monitors like they had just performed a miracle instead of simple emergency medicine. Around them, the hospital hummed its 4 a.m. hum, ventilators breathing, fluorescent lights buzzing their eternal insect drone, somewhere down the corridor a monitor alarming, then someone silencing it. The ordinary sounds of a hospital where extraordinary things happened every night and almost nobody noticed. That was when Dr. Pierce walked in. He didn't shout. Didn't raise his voice. His eyes moved from Elena to the surgical field to Webb's vitals to Elena's face, and his expression calcified into something professionally contained and terrifyingly calm. When he spoke, his voice had the flat administrative tone of someone reading a termination notice aloud. "Step away from the patient." Elena set down the final dressing and moved away from the bed without argument. She knew what was coming. She had known since the moment she made the first incision that this choice had an expiration date, and that expiration date was now. Dr. Pierce didn't look at her again. He simply turned and walked out, and that absence of anger was somehow more terrifying than any explosion of rage could have been. This was a man whose power came from institutional systems, not from passion. He would dismantle her systematically. Elena scrubbed out at the sink, watching the surgical residue spiral down the drain. The soap was antiseptic, that hospital smell of everything sterilized and controlled. She could still feel the scalpel in her fingers, the exact resistance of fascia beneath the blade, the small satisfaction of pressure releasing. She had saved Colonel Webb's legs. That was the fact that would matter in 8 hours when nobody else would remember it. That was the fact that would sit in her chest while everything else burned. She was still washing her hands when Dr. Pierce made the first phone call to the chief of surgery at 4:35 a.m., a conversation Elena couldn't hear but could interpret by the pauses in his voice, the careful administrative language about unauthorized surgical intervention and scope of practice violation. 20 minutes later he called 2 board members, his voice smooth as a negotiator, each pause suggesting a favor being called, a debt being collected. By 4:58 a.m., he had reassigned the 2 attending physicians who had documented Webb's pre-surgical vitals to different hospital floors, effective immediately. The evidence was being scattered like ashes. At 5:03 a.m., Dr. Pierce accessed the digital scheduling system from his office and altered the records. Elena wasn't supposed to have been in that room during the 3:52 a.m. time window. The system now reflected that. At 5:09 a.m., he restricted her access badge remotely, the badge still hanging around her neck, still active, suddenly dormant. A surgical permission erased from a computer. A career deleted by a keystroke. The administrative paperwork was already being drafted when Elena walked into the break room at 5:15 a.m. She didn't sit down. Just stood there while Dr. Pierce's administrative assistant printed the termination notice on official hospital letterhead, gross violation of surgical protocol. Practicing medicine without a license. Exceeding scope of practice. Insubordination. The paper felt thin and final in his hands when he read it aloud to her, his voice the exact tone of someone describing weather. Hospital security escorted her to her locker 10 minutes later. They were polite about it. Professional. The kind of polite that made it worse. They allowed her to take one personal item, the field journal, still smelling of dust and pressed flowers from a desert she had tried to leave behind. Nothing else. They walked her to her car in the parking garage where the concrete was still dark with the false night of underground levels, where nobody could see her leaving, where the only witness was the fluorescent light humming above her and the echo of her footsteps on concrete. The security officer took her badge. His name was Marcus, and he had treated her with kindness during her shifts, had complimented her ability to handle difficult patients. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. She nodded and didn't speak. There was nothing to say to kindness. Kindness just made the erosion more complete. Elena sat in her car for 2 hours after they left. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Engine off. Keys in her lap. The sun rose through the parking garage levels, painting the concrete in shades of grey that slowly became tan, then gold. She didn't move. She had nowhere to go. She didn't know how to be anything except someone who saves lives no matter the cost to herself, and she had just discovered that the cost was everything. Her job. Her reference. Her ability to work in any hospital that would contact her previous employer. The field journal sat on the passenger seat, and she didn't open it because she knew what she would find: pressed flowers from a place she had tried to escape, pressed flowers from a place that had followed her home. At 7:30 a.m. she finally turned the key. The engine started. She drove to her apartment and sat on the couch staring at the field journal while the light moved across the walls. The sun climbed. The sun fell. Another night came. Nobody called. Nobody came. On the third day, when the silence had weight, when the apartment had become a place where time moved differently than it did in the world outside, when Elena had begun to understand what it meant to be severed from every identity she had ever constructed, her phone rang. Sarah's voice came through shaking, "You need to come back. Now." Dr. Pierce made the first call at 4:17 a.m., before the sun had any intention of rising over Colorado Springs. The hospital corridors were empty except for the hum of ventilators and the soft beeping of monitors that never stopped, never rested, never forgave. He sat in his office with the door locked and a list of names written in his own careful handwriting: board members, colleagues, people who had benefited from his recommendations over the years, people who owed him favors the way creditors collect debts. The voice on the other end of the first call was groggy, confused by the hour. Dr. Pierce didn't apologize for the time. "Marcus, it's Richard Pierce from St. Michael's. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention on the credentialing committee." His tone was smooth, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "A nurse has grossly violated surgical protocol tonight. I need documentation of her termination processed before 6 a.m. Standard insubordination clause." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Marcus didn't ask questions. He said, "I'll call the director. It'll be handled." The line went dead. Dr. Pierce crossed the first name from his list. By 4:31 a.m., he had made 7 calls. 7 board members, each one owing him something: a research grant approved, a disciplinary hearing dismissed, a position recommended. 7 calls, and 7 confirmations that the paperwork would be expedited, that the process would move faster than protocol normally allowed, that Elena Martinez would be a name in a termination file by sunrise. But Dr. Pierce knew that firing her wasn't enough. Firing her only removed her from the building. He needed to remove her from every building. He needed to ensure that no hospital from here to Denver would touch her resume without seeing the red flags he was about to plant. The second phase began at 4:45 a.m. He pulled up the hospital scheduling system on his personal computer, the one that lived in his locked office, the one that very few people had administrative access to. The records of Elena's authorization to enter the surgical bay during the fasciotomy were clean, documented, time-stamped, verified. He deleted them. Not obviously. Not in a way that would immediately trigger an audit. He simply replaced the authorization records with blanks, gaps in the timeline that would look like clerical errors rather than deliberate sabotage. He made it appear as though no nurse had logged entry authorization for that room at 3:52 a.m. The system now showed that the bay had been accessed by unauthorized personnel. The system now showed a protocol violation, a failure of credentialing, a serious breach. Then he called the 2 nurses who had been present during Webb's pre-surgical vitals check, the 2 people who had witnessed Elena reading the patient file, the 2 people who could testify that she had legitimate reason to be in that room, that she had been following standard procedure. The calls came at 4:53 a.m. and 5:02 a.m. respectively. Both nurses answered because Dr. Pierce had authority, and authority doesn't ask nicely at that hour of the morning. "Jennifer, I'm reassigning you to the pediatric ward effective immediately. I need you to pack your personal items from the ER and report to Dr. Helmuth by 7 a.m. She tried to protest. He cut her off. "This isn't a discussion. It's a staffing adjustment." The second nurse, Marcus Chen, received an identical call. Different ward. Same message. Same finality. Both had witnessed the fasciotomy. Both had seen Elena's competence. Both were now scattered to different floors, their testimony separated, their memories isolated from each other, their credibility as witnesses fragmented across different departments. The access badge restriction came next. Dr. Pierce made one more call, to the security chief, and Elena's badge was remotely deactivated at 5:08 a.m. The moment she tried to exit the scrub room where she was cleaning the blood from her hands, where she was removing the surgical gloves that had been inside another human being's body, the doors would refuse her. The electronic locks would recognize her credentials as invalid. She would be trapped for exactly 47 seconds before a security officer arrived to escort her out, and every second of those 47 seconds would feel like betrayal. But it was the termination letter that was the masterwork. Dr. Pierce printed it himself at 5:11 a.m. on hospital letterhead, his signature bold and authoritative at the bottom. He detailed the violations: gross violation of surgical protocol, performance of invasive surgical procedure without proper authorization, exceeding scope of nursing practice, failure to follow chain of command. Each charge was technically defensible. Each one was also a carefully constructed lie. The letter was dated 5:14 a.m., timestamped to look like an administrative decision that had been made after careful deliberation, not a pre-dawn revenge execution. Hospital security met Elena in the hallway outside the surgical bay at 5:16 a.m. They didn't know the truth. They simply knew that the badge reader had flagged her access as restricted and that Dr. Pierce had instructed them to escort her to the HR office. The security chief, a man named Davis who had always nodded at Elena in the break room, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry. I don't make these calls. HR needs to process your termination paperwork." Termination. Not reassignment. Not investigation. Termination. The word hung in the fluorescent-lit hallway like contaminated air. The HR director, Pam Vickers, looked tired. She had been called in early for this meeting, and her coffee was still steaming. She slid the termination letter across her desk without making eye contact. "You're being terminated effective immediately for gross violation of surgical protocol. Your access badge is being revoked. Your employee file will be flagged in the state nursing registry indicating termination for cause. This will affect your ability to obtain employment at other medical facilities." The words were professional, bureaucratic, designed to sound neutral. They landed like bullets. Each one accurate. Each one chosen to wound. Elena read the letter without trembling. The word swam in front of her eyes, but her hands were steady. The nurse who had cut into human tissue at 3:52 a.m. with the precision of someone who had done this before, who had done it in places where the light came from explosions and the operating table was dirt, read her own professional death warrant with the same composure she had maintained when Dr. Pierce called her Marta Martinez over the intercom, when he backed her against the supply room shelves, when he announced her demotion in front of her entire team. She didn't ask questions. She didn't defend herself. She simply said, "I understand," and signed the paperwork they placed in front of her. The signature was Elena Martinez, steady cursive, each letter formed with the discipline of someone who had signed things that mattered far more than this: documents that sent soldiers into fire, orders that cost lives, reports that changed fates. This signature mattered too. This signature was the moment everything changed. Security walked her to her locker at 5:19 a.m. She had worked at St. Michael's Hospital for 4 years. She had taken the job specifically because it was in Colorado Springs, because it was far from the military world that had destroyed her, because she wanted to save lives in a way that didn't involve orders or chains of command or carrying the weight of other people's survival. She had believed that nursing could be redemption. She had been wrong about many things, but that belief had felt true for 4 years. Her locker was small. The field journal with the pressed desert flowers sat on the top shelf, exactly where she had left it before the shift. She reached for it and her hand stopped. The journal belonged to Commander Elena Martinez. The woman standing in the locker room at 5:22 a.m. belonged to no one anymore. She took the journal anyway. It was the only thing she owned that mattered. The parking garage was empty. Early morning in Colorado Springs moved slowly, and the sun hadn't yet convinced the city that it was time to wake up. Elena sat in her car, a blue Honda Civic with 127,000 miles and a thermostat that worked only if you knew exactly how to jiggle the dial, and she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The leather was cold. The parking garage was cold. Everything was cold. She had nowhere to go. Her apartment existed, but going there meant sitting in a space she had filled with nothing, a place she had never called home because she had been trained by the military to travel light, to leave no trace, to never assume she would wake up in the same location twice. Her apartment was a hotel room with a lease. The hospital had been as close to belonging as she had gotten in 18 years. The engine wouldn't turn over. Not because the car was broken, but because Elena couldn't imagine where she would drive it. Every highway led somewhere, and every somewhere required purpose. She had purpose once. That had been taken from her in Ramadi 3 years ago when Colonel Webb, the same man she had cut open to save his life at 3:52 a.m., had court-martialed her for a mission decision that intelligence later proved correct. She had lost purpose then, and she had found a substitute, helping people, healing people, doing something useful with hands that had once held weapons and given orders that changed the trajectory of other people's lives. Now she had nothing again. No purpose. No uniform. No rank. No field journal entry for today because nothing worth recording had happened. She had simply been destroyed by a man she had threatened with knowledge of his corruption. It was efficient. It was methodical. It was exactly the kind of thing that Special Forces training taught you to expect. When your opponent realizes you are a threat, they neutralize you before you can act. Dr. Pierce had simply done what any competent adversary would do. Elena sat in the cold car in the dim parking garage for 2 hours. The sun came up over Colorado Springs. The city woke. Shift change happened without her. The hospital continued its work without her. Her absence was a gap that would be filled by the next nurse with a license and a willingness to work nights. The world did not stop. The world did not notice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Elena recognized the moment she was living through. This was not the first time she had been removed from service. This was not the first time she had been broken by an institution that decided she was expendable. The court-martial in Ramadi had taken 18 months to destroy her career. Dr. Pierce had done it in 4 hours. The efficiency was almost admirable. She had a choice now. She could walk away. She could find a job that didn't involve lives hanging in the balance. She could become the thing she had always feared, someone ordinary, someone without purpose, someone who existed without significance. Or she could stay. She could fight. She could do what she had refused to do after the court-martial, which was to use her voice, to demand justice, to call the people who might listen and force them to see the truth. Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Not from fear. From restraint. From the terrible knowledge that she was capable of things that would make what Dr. Pierce had done look like a minor inconvenience. She was trained to identify threats and eliminate them. Dr. Pierce was a threat. The system that protected him was a threat. But Elena had made a choice for years ago to stop being the kind of person who eliminated threats. She had become a nurse instead. The question was whether that choice was still valid. Whether it had ever been real or if she was simply pretending to be something she could never actually become. Whether healing could ever truly be her purpose or if violence and justice and the military code were the only languages she actually understood. Elena turned the key. The engine turned over on the first try. She pulled out of the parking garage and drove toward Colorado Springs, toward an apartment that wasn't home, toward a day with no purpose and no meaning, toward a waiting that would last exactly 3 days before a phone call would change everything. The sun climbed higher. The day that had destroyed her continued forward without pause, indifferent to her suffering, indifferent to injustice, indifferent to the fact that the most qualified person in that hospital had been removed not because of incompetence but because she had threatened the wrong man's profit margin. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Hit that like button now. And I need to know, would you have revealed your identity, or stayed invisible? Drop your answer below. Subscribe so you never miss a story.